right, let's finish this out. Chapter 33, Section 3, the end of the war. The war produced strange within all these nations, but most of them will manage, often ruthlessly, and try to cope with food riots, strikes, and mutinies. And in the Russian Empire, the war amplified existing stresses to such an extent that the Romanov dynasty was forced to abdicate in favor of a provisional government in the spring of 1917. Now, it's going to undermine the Russian state. We get disintegrating armies, mutinies, and food shortages, provoking a series of street demonstrations and strikes in Petrograd or St. Petersburg, and the inability of the police forces to suppress these uprisings and subsequent mutiny of troops garrisoned in the capital will persuade the Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate his throne, and the Romanov dynasty will disappear after 300 years of uninterrupted rule, no longer a monarchy there. And the March Revolution, the first of two revolutions in 1917, will be an unplanned and incomplete affair. But we have to take note that in February and October, these revolutions will reflect the Russian use of the Julian calendar in more internationally accepted use of the Gregorian calendar, where these will take place in March and November. Now, after the successes in Petrograd, the revolution is going to start to spread through the country, and the power in Russia will shift to two new agencies, the provincial government and the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies. Soviets, which had these revolutionary councils organized by socialists, will appear for the first time during the Russian Revolution of 1905. Now, in 1917, Soviets of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies will surface all over Russia, wield considerable power through their control of factories and segments of the military. The period between March and November will witness a political struggle between the provincial government and the powerful Petrograd Soviet. Now, at first, the new government enjoyed considerable public support. They disbanded Tsar's police, repealed all limitations on freedom of speech, press, and association, and abolished laws that discriminate against ethnic or religious groups. But it failed to satisfy the popular demands of ending the war, feeding the people, and reform of land. So that was the biggest issues that it unfortunately could not handle or could not figure out, but allowing the Allies, and this commitment that they had to the Allies, was something that they had in high regard. Now enter Lenin. Now, Vladimir Lenin is going to be exiled in Switzerland. He'll be born into a warm and loving family. He'll grow up in the confines of a moderately prosperous family and live in the provincial Russian town of Simbirsk. In 1887, shortly after his father's death, the police will arrest and hang his older brother for plotting to assassinate the Tsar, and this will sear Lenin in his youth. That will come back to and kind of follow him throughout. Now, he'll have a brief career as a lawyer. He'll spend many years abroad and devote himself to studying Marxist thought and writing political pamphlets. And in contrast to Marx, Lenin viewed the working class, as incapable of developing proper revolutionary consciousness that would lead to effective political action. He believed that the industrial proletariat required some type of leadership or well-organized and highly disciplined party. Now, what we get is in a moment of high drama, the German High Command is going to transport Lenin and other revolutionaries in 1917, in a sealed train, in hope that this anti-war activist will stir up trouble and bring about Russia's withdrawal from the war. Lenin will head the Bolsheviks, this radical wing of Russian Social Democratic Party, and in April he'll begin calling for the transfer of legal authority to the Soviets and advocate uncompromising opposition to the war. Initially, his party opposes radicalism, but he soon succeeded in converting his fellow Bolsheviks to his proposal. Now, what that brings us to is the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks, who are a small minority among revolutionary working parties, will eventually gain control of Petrograd Soviets. Now, some of their more famous slogans we will see will be peace, land, and bread, all power to the Soviets. And what we'll see is them seize power in the name of the All-Russian National Congress of Soviets, which was then convening in Petrograd. Now, during the night of November 6th and the following day, they will have armed workers, soldiers, sailors. They will storm the Winter Palace, which will be the home of the provincial government. And by the afternoon of November 7th, the virtually bloodless insurrection will run its course, and power will now pass from the provincial government into Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. So, Lenin will take control, and that brings us to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Bolshevik rulers ended Russia's involvement in the Great War by signing this treaty on March 3rd, 1918. What it will give is Germany will have possessions or control of much of Russia's territory, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, Finland, Poland, and the Ukraine, 1/4 of its population. And the terms of the treaty were harsh and humiliating, but taking Russia out of the war gave this new government the opportunity, one, to deal with the ills of society and try to rectify something out of this, but also, two, it gets Germany what it wants, and now it can concentrate everything it has, its resources, its soldiers, its industrial capacity, to the Western Front. So knocking out an ally and letting them focus everything they have on the West, because the United States has already entered the war. Now, real quick, let's take a look at this photograph. This is Vladimir Lenin making a speech in the Red Square on the first anniversary in 1918 of the Bolshevik Revolution, as this is getting underway and the USSR is now being created officially, and he is making his speech to show the rest of Russia what his plans are for the future and in going forward. Now, with the U.S. intervention, as the United States will finally get into the war, we see economic considerations, as the dependence of the neutral United States is dependent on the sale of goods to the Allies, but it is more economically driven than want of getting in for any other reason. It's sunk a lot of munitions into the British and the French. The Allies have been paying them considerable amounts of money, and so they're economically tied. But also, too, Woodrow Wilson is also going through his speech at the time, and he's firmly opposing intervention in a European war, and it's in a re-election year as well, in 1916. And because he campaigns on non-intervention, of course, he's not really obliged to get in at the moment. But because of this economic dependence that we have here, they're going to have increasing debts to the American banks, and all the munitions and time and effort that has been spent into the Allies as far as supplies go. It's looking more and more like the United States needs to get in for economic reasons, but also to ensure that debts get paid and to ensure that the money keeps flowing into the United States. They have to have a Allied victory. Nothing else would suffice, especially when you look at the economic side of it. So this is going to persuade a lot of Americans that an Allied victory will be a good financial sense. And then in the spring of 1917, the Allies will basically deplete their means of paying for any essential supplies from the United States, and they probably couldn't even have maintained their war effort had it not been for the United States in not remaining neutral. So this Allied victory was really the only thing that could really get the payments, but also have the money and the time and the effort pay off in the end for the United States. Now, we look at the German blockade of British overseas trade, and especially submarine patrols. Even though they are going to be patrolling heavily because their navy's caught up in other areas, the Germans are going to rely heavily on their submarine warfare. What we see is U.S. government officials will assert that traditional doctrine of neutral rights for American ships because they wanted to continue trading with these nations, but most notably, obviously, the British and French. Now, they're going to look at this from a standpoint of hoping that the United States, even if provoked, won't get into this war, but we're going to have an event that will take us there anyway. So the German military experts will calculate that submarine attacks against the ships of Great Britain and all the ships headed to Great Britain hopefully is going to bring about defeat in anywhere from about 6 or so months. Now, the deciding factor is going to be on May 7, 1915, when a German submarine will sink the British passenger liner, the Lusitania, off the Irish coast, and will have a loss of about 1,198 lives, and including 128 U.S. citizens. But technically, this ship was a legitimate target because it carried 4,200 cases of ammunition and traveled through a declared war zone. But we'll have the American public that will be outraged, and during the next 2 years, the country's mood will increasingly turn towards the tide to go to war against Germany. But then also, too, the Zimmerman telegraph is going to be a big indication as well, as the American public will push after this comes out. So there's going to be a coded telegram that will be sent by the Foreign Secretary of the German Empire, Arthur Zimmerman, to the German ambassador in Mexico. And this Zimmerman telegraph is basically going to be a telegraph to say, hey, Mexico, if the United States enters into the war, you should come in and be an ally to the Central Powers. And it's pretty much a distraction, or at least they hope it to be. And if they win, they will get basically the lands lost from the United States. Now, Mexico, with potentially possibly thinking about it, will ultimately say no when the United States enters the war. And then what we will have is, even though the British blockade will direct at the Central Powers, be directed at the Central Powers constantly, and interfere with American shipping, Woodrow Wilson will nonetheless move this nation to war against Germany in January of 1917. Even though the country is still at peace, Wilson will begin to enumerate the U.S. war aims, and on the 2nd of April, he urges the Congress of the United States to adopt a war resolution. And a lot of people, there's some pushback, and especially because we have this idea that maybe this is more for the money than any other reason, as far as just ending the war and tyranny and everything else and getting back to peace, and more of democracy can operate in peacetime, but also the economics of it can operate smoother in peacetime. And so we get George W. Norris that will argue this and want to stay neutral, and he will say, quote, "I feel that we are about to put a $sign upon the American flag." And even though with this protest, and you can make your argument that he's not wrong, we will have the United States enter World War I. Now let's look at this painting in 1915 with artist Willie Stower's depiction of a ship sinking as a result of a submarine attack. And you can see that there are lifeboats there. It surfaces as it's checking out the damage, and you can see people on the top of the submarine looking over the destruction that is caused. And these submarines were pretty effective for the limited amount that they had, especially with all the other resources back in the continent of Europe. But using these very effectively discouraged a lot of shipping, but nonetheless, it was this that kind of pushed the United States towards war. Next up, we will see this 1917-18 U.S. Army recruitment poster that depicts an apish monster leaving war-torn Europe in the background, and you can see in the sand there emerging on the shores of America, but wielding a club labeled a Kultur and wearing a spiked helmet that will be associated with Prussian and German militarism. And this is a less than subtle caricature of the threat emanating from a warmongering Germany, and you can see them trying to use the scare tactic and this fear tactic of this is what will happen if we lose. Now, we talked about economic implications of this, but still playing on the fears of and public opinion of the Germans in general. Now, moving over to collapsing fronts. What we'll see here is just corrosive effects of the war and bloodshed and bloodletting that will be shown. For the first 2 years of conflict, most people, like we talked about, will support their government's war efforts, but continuing ravages of war will take their toll everywhere. April 1916, we have Irish nationalists that will have the Great Easter Rebellion and have unsuccessful attempts to overthrow the British rule in Ireland. Central Powers, we said earlier, will suffer from food shortages as a result of the British blockade, and also increasing numbers of people took to the streets to demonstrate against declining food rations. Food riots were complemented by strikes as pre-war social conflicts reemerged. Governments reacted harshly to those challenges, pouncing on strikers, suppressing demonstrators, and jailing dissidents. And equally dangerous was the breakdown of military discipline at the German naval base in Kiel. Sailors revolted in the summer of 1917 and again much more seriously in the fall of 1918. Now, in the wake of another failed offensive during the spring of 1917, this resulted in ghastly casualties. French soldiers lost confidence in their leadership. When ordered to attack once again, they refused. The extent of the mutiny was enormous. We get 50,000 soldiers that were involved in this, and resulting in 23,385 court-martials and 432 death sentences. So tight was French censorship that the Germans, who could have taken advantage of the situation, did not learn about the mutiny until the war is over. Now, against the background of civilian disillusionment and deteriorating economic conditions, Germany took the risk of throwing its remaining might at the Western Front in the spring of 1918 and had nothing to lose. The gamble failed, and as the offensive petered out, the Allies broke through the front and started pushing the Germans back. By that time, Germany had effectively exhausted its human and material means to wage war. Meanwhile, Bulgaria capitulated to the invading Allies on the September 30th. The Ottomans concluded an armistice on October 30th, and Austria-Hungary surrendered on November 4th. And finally, the Germans accepted an armistice which took effect on November 11th of 1918, and the last guns were sent silent. Now, let's look at after the war. And one thing that we got to talk about, because of its relevancy obviously now, is a lot of the things that will impact these nations going forward. Now, obviously, the physical destruction was pretty visible, especially in northern France and Belgium, and we talked about the deaths that had happened. But a lot of millions of people will succumb to the effects of starvation, malnutrition, and epidemic diseases, and that's where we'll pick up with the influenza pandemic of 1918. The end of the war will kind of coincide with its arrival, and it will kind of come and go, and it'll be quick, and it will vanish by mid-1919. Now, the Great War did not cause this pandemic, but because of all the wartime traffic on land and sea, it probably had a little bit of contribution to why it spread so much. And the young were affected as well. This flu killed more people than all the wars that the United States was in the 20th century. The Pacific Islands suffered the worst of all, as the flu wiped out up to 25% of the entire population. This flu, just like what we're dealing with now with the coronavirus, does not discriminate. Young people were getting sick, rich people were getting sick, poor people were getting sick. And it was a time of panic when people were really trying to figure out how to deal with it, because there was no cure for this. Now, when we look at the Paris settlement, before the costs of war were assessed fully, the world is going to have its attention shift to Paris, where we'll have representation and have it basically be dominated by France, Great Britain, and the United States. George Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Woodrow Wilson will be the representatives for the French, Great British, and the United States. And they will dominate these deliberations. We will have no central power representation, and this will pretty much be a dictated peace, because they basically threatened the central powers and said, if you do not accept the terms of these treaties, then the war is basically going to be right back on and continue. But significantly, the Soviet Union was not invited to the conference. Throughout this time, though, the British will still have their blockade of Germany that will remain in effect, just to add a sense of urgency to the proceedings. And then that situation will give rise to this dictated peace that we talked about, but especially because no foreign troops set foot on German soil. Now, when we look at what most people talk about with this treaty, with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, and this is going to be set out to hopefully be the war that ends all wars and the treaty that ends it all, even though a lot of his 14 points won't be considered. Probably the one that might be talked about the most being his League of Nations, that will kind of set the precedence for the United Nations, even though it never happens, and Congress kind of shoots this 14 points down because of the entanglements and other reasons too. But his dream never comes to fruition for this treaty and these 14 points. But some of the recommendations for the 14 points: open agreements of peace will openly be arrived at, absolute freedom of navigation on the seas in peace and war, the removal of all economic barriers and the establishment of an equality of trade conditions among all nations, adequate guarantees for a reduction in national armaments, adjustments of colonial disputes to give equal weight to the interest of the controlling government and the colonial population, and a call for a general association of nations. And some allies are going to oppose some of these points to this peace formula, because those points are compromising the secret wartime agreements by which they had agreed to distribute among themselves some of the territories and possessions of the defeated nations. And the defeated powers in turn will obviously feel betrayed when they face harsh peace treaties that are clearly violating the spirit of the 14 points. And these peace treaties will be harsh for the Central Powers, because they are going to blame guilt on Germany. They're going to split up Austria-Hungary. His population is going to lose a third of the territory, and its population is going to go down from 28 to 8 million. We're going to see Germany have its military reduced to only 100,000 troops. Reparations be paid because of the blame for the war, have no navy or an air force. So these treaties are going to hit very, very hard going forward for the Central Powers. We also do have a treaty going forward that we'll talk about a little bit later with the Ottomans in the next slide. But what I want to get to next in this picture, this is going to be the political leaders that will be signing the Treaty of Versailles, which among other provisions controversially will compel the Germans to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. And a lot of people will talk about how the Treaty of Versailles actually basically made World War II, or set the motion for World War II, because of how harsh this treaty was. Now, when we look at this picture, we can see the toll in human life in terms of the dead, but also disfigured survivors. This is a brutally scarred French soldier in 1918, and it vividly represented the human cost of war. But like we said, exact numbers are kind of hard to come about as far as exact. But like we said, the estimates suggest that 8.5 million soldiers were dead, and a far greater number, some 21 million soldiers, suffered injuries, and many of them so serious, obviously in this picture, scarring people permanently, as in the case here. Now, let's look at the end of the Ottoman Empire with the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, removing Balkan and Arab provinces and allowing for European occupation in South and East Anatolia. The treaty was acceptable to the government of Sultan Mohammed VI, but not to the Turkish nationalists who rally around their wartime hero, Mustafa Kemal, as head of the Turkish nationalist movement. Now, he will set out to defy these terms. He'll organize a national army, drive out the Greek, British, French, and Italian occupation forces, and abolish the Sultanate and replace it with the Republic of Turkey, with Ankara as its capital. Now, in this victory for these Turkish nationals, the Allied powers will actually officially recognize the Republic of Turkey in a final peace agreement with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. What we'll also get is this intensely secular government and this program of modernization that will emphasize economic development and secularism. The policy is going to result in replacement of religious with secular institutions of education, justice, the emancipation of women, including their right to vote, the adoption of European-derived law, Hindu-Arabic numerals, the Roman alphabet, and Western clothing. And theoretically, heading a constitutional democracy, Ataturk, which will be Mustafa Kemal, as will be known as the father of the Turks, will rule Turkey as a virtual dictator until his death in 1938. Now, all in all, the problem that this treaty is ultimately going to have, and all of these treaties are going to have, is just dealing with the issues that a lot of these countries had. German expansionist aims in Europe, which probably played a role in the nation's decision to enter the Great War, will remain unsolved. Same thing with Italy, with its idea in the Balkans, and the Japanese with its influence in China. So these issues are going to ensure that in 2 decades following these peace settlements, this will become merely a 20-year truce characterized by power, rivalries, and intermittent violence that will lead to, again, another global war. Now, let's look at the League of Nations. This is going to be put forward in an effort to avoid future destructive conflicts. And the League is going to be the first permanent international security organization that principal mission was to maintain world peace. This is obviously at the urging of Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points. Now, this is going to have 42 original member states and 26 non-European states. The reason for that is to suggest that it transcends European interests, and this isn't all about Europe, which can't blame them. Sometimes that's usually what it boils down to. But the League had 2 major flaws that will basically render itself ineffective. First, designed to solve international disputes through arbitration, it had no power to enforce its decisions. Second, it relied on collective security as a tool for the preservation of global peace. And the basic premise underlying collective security arrangements was a concept that aggression against one state or any state was considered aggression against all of these other states. And so the issue going forward with that is a lot of these member states will be in and out of the League of Nations. And because they are in and out of the League of Nations, they don't really have any teeth or any merit. We see the United States never joined the organization because the U.S. Senate rejected the idea. Germany, which viewed the League as a club of allied victors, and Japan, which saw it as an instrument of imperialism, left the League of Nations in 1933, as did smaller powers. Italy will leave. The Soviet Union will leave. And so this is just kind of a mess that never gets fixed. The idea is there. The idea on paper is there, but when we put it in, when we put it out there to actually work, it does not work. But we do see an application of self-determination in Wilson's concept of self-determination, as like we've discussed before, this promotion of countries being able to be independent and have this nationalism to form some type of country. We see this in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes until 1929. Will already exist as sovereign states by 1918, and by the end of the conference, the principle of self-determination had triumphed in many areas that were previously under the control of the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. But in other instances, such as Austria and Germany, those people were denied the right to form one nation. So it's kind of one of those things that just depends on who it is and where it is. The mandate system, however imperfect the results, the peacemakers at Paris tried to apply the principle of self-determination and nationality throughout Europe and elsewhere. However, they did not do so. And the mandate system will try to create to control formerly colonized areas. And we see this especially, in the Middle East, where a lot of people are going to start to look at this mandate system as just an updated version of imperialism. The Germans will interpret the mandate system as a division of colonial booty by the victors who had conveniently forgotten to apply the tutelage provision to their own colonies, and especially when they start to dismantle German colonies. We'll also see the Ottoman Empire that will be broken up as well, and the mandate system basically saying whichever power of the Allies can take on this burden and help these colonies out, especially in a tumultuous time like this, can take on that burden. So we see that the French and British leaders during the war will promise Arab nationalists independence from the Ottoman Empire, and had promised Jewish nationalists in Europe a homeland in Palestine, where the Arabs hoped to form independent states. The French in Lebanon and Syria, and the British in Iraq and Palestine will establish mandates. And the Allies viewed the mandate system as a reasonable compromise between the reality of imperialism and the ideal self-determination. To the people who are directly affected, the mandate system will smack them of continual imperial rule that will just be cloaked in some type of respectability. So just kind of changing a little bit of how imperialism actually looks and not calling it for what it is. Now, let's finish this up with the challenges to European preeminence. We see Europe's diminished economic stature with loss of overseas investments in foreign markets and reversal of economic relationships with the United States, and then Europe's global hegemony will be weakened. So basically what we're saying is this: their economic structure with losing overseas investments in foreign markets is going to greatly impede on their economy, and a lot of these nations will recover economically, but the damage has already been done as far as long term. The decline in European power was closely related to their economics, like we said, as a result of the commitment in their total war. We will see some of these things like high rates of inflation and huge public debt that they will overcome, but the economic dislocations that will be most significant is, like we said, overseas investments, foreign markets, which had brought them huge financial returns, but also too this idea of independence in their colonies, and anti-colonialism sentiments will start to bubble up from this as well. And nothing is more indicative of Europe's reduced economic might than the reversal of their relationship with the United States, where the United States was a debtor nation before 1914, owing billions of dollars to European investors, and by 1919 the roles were reversed and it was a major creditor. But also a loss of prestige in overseas and weakening grip on the colonies will reflect the undermining of Europe's global hegemony. A lot of the colonial subjects in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific will often view the Great War as a civil war among European nations and will be a bloody spectacle that these bearers of an alleged superior society vilified and slaughtered one another. But also, too, the idea of the spread of some of these revolutionary ideas to the colonies. The war will also help spread this. And the U.S. war aims, kind of spelled out in the 14 points, gives hope to these people under the imperial rule and promote of nationalist aspirations. The peacemakers will repeatedly invoke the concept of self-determination, and Wilson will publicly propose that in all colonial questions, the interests of the native population be given equal weight with the desires of European governments. Wilson seems to call on nothing less than national independence and self-rule. Nationalists struggling to organize anti-imperialist resistance also sought inspiration from the Soviet Union, where their leaders denounced all forms of imperialism and pledged their support for independence movements. So taken all together, these messages were subversive to imperial control and had a great appeal for colonial people. The post-war disappointments and temporary setbacks experienced by nationalist movements did not diminish their desire for self-rule and self-determination. And these are just going to be some of the lasting effects that we will see going forward into the interwar years, and then ultimately kind of start the cause of what World War II will become. A lot of historians will argue if you change the Treaty of Versailles, if you kind of change the wording and it's not as harsh, and the League of Nations has more teeth, then maybe World War II doesn't happen. But then obviously you can argue it the other way, because the economies of these powers and these nations that will be hit will be greatly affected, because while the victorious nations are able to overcome some of these economic hardships, others are not, which will kind of set the stage for where we're going next in chapter 34. Real quick before we go, and draw your attention to these two images. First one being the territorial changes in Europe after the Great War. You can see the losses by Russia in the west. You can see the territory lost by the Germans in the east and the west. You can see the demilitarized zone there. That's kind of a buffer state between Germany, Belgium, and France. You can see territory lost by Bulgaria there in the southeast. You can see also demilitarized zone as in Istanbul as well. And then obviously the biggest loss other than Russia is the loss of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the territory that is lost there, with Czechoslovakia and Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and parts of Romania. So the European map changing drastically after World War I. Now shifting over to the next image, this is going to be a territorial change in Southwest Asia after the Great War. You can see in the green where the Ottoman Empire used to be, we get the Republic of Turkey in the north. You can see Syria and Iraq and Transjordan and Palestine. And these areas that we talked about will be League of Nations mandates in 1920, and then also British protectorates. But again, seeing the map that is changing to what we see in the early 1920s. All right, and that's where we're going to leave it off for now until we pick this up again next week for chapter 34. Don't be afraid to hit the like button and or leave a comment and subscribe. Peace.